Okay, so have you ever heard that quote? I think it's attributed to Voltaire, but it's something like, when a diplomat says yes, he means perhaps. When he says perhaps, he means no. And when he says no, he is not a diplomat.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah, I always find that so fascinating because it really highlights something that philosophers have always grappled with. The fact that what we say, the actual words we use,
Right, the literal
yeah,
meaning.
the literal meaning, it's often just the tip of the iceberg, and there are all these layers of meaning and intention underneath.
Exactly, and that's really where pragmatics comes in.
Ah, pragmatics. So that's our deep dive today, and luckily we have this fantastic resource from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy to guide us.
It's a great overview of the field.
Yeah, and I'm already intrigued because they define pragmatics as the study of utterances, which are basically these intentional acts of speaking or writing that happen at specific times and places.
And crucially, they involve language.
Yeah, so it's different from just looking at the meaning of words or sentences in a kind of abstract way like we might do in logic or semantics.
Right, pragmatics is all about how those words and sentences are actually used in the real world in these concrete instances of communication.
And that's where context comes in, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Context is key. It shapes how we interpret what's being said and what's being implied.
So I guess that's one of the big challenges for philosophers. How do we account for the role of context in a rigorous way?
Yeah, it gets really tricky really fast. Think
Yeah.
about it. How much of our understanding of an utterance comes from just decoding the words themselves, and how much comes from our background knowledge, our assumptions about the speaker's intentions, all those things that aren't explicitly stated.
Exactly. It's like we're constantly filling in the gaps and making inferences without even realizing it.
Right, and to make sense of all this complexity, it's helpful to have some kind of framework, and luckily our sources offer a bunch of different perspectives, both classical and contemporary.
Ah, so it's a real philosophical buffet today. We've got all these different theories on how we move from just the literal meaning of language to this much richer understanding of what's being communicated.
It's a feast for the philosophical mind.
Definitely a feast. So let's try to break this down for our listener. What's our mission today?
Well, I think we need to unpack some of these complex ideas about meaning, intention, and context, and really examine the philosophical questions they raise.
Okay, sounds good to me. So where should we begin?
Well, I think it makes sense to start with what's often called classical far side pragmatics, which is basically looking at what's going on beyond the literal meaning of the words.
Beyond the words. Okay, so what are some of the key theories in that area?
But we have to start with Austin and Searle and their work on speech acts.
Right. J.L. Austin, that was the guy who was obsessed with how we do things with words.
Exactly. He was really interested in the performative aspect of language, how we can actually change the world by saying certain things.
So it's not just about describing reality, it's about creating it in a sense.
Right. And initially, he made this distinction between constitutives and performatives.
So constitutives are like statements or descriptions that can be true or false.
Yeah, whereas performatives are utterances that actually do something in the very act of being spoken, like saying, I do, in a marriage ceremony, or I promise, or even something like, I named this ship the Queen Mary.
Right, so it's like the words themselves are the action.
Exactly. And that was a pretty radical idea at the time because it challenged the traditional view that the primary function of language is to represent the world.
So Austin was saying, hey, language can be a tool for action too.
Precisely. He was highlighting this dynamic aspect of language use.
Okay, but as is often the case in philosophy, that initial distinction between constitutives and performatives turned out to be a bit too simplistic, right?
Yeah, it didn't quite capture the full complexity of what was going on.
And that's where Austin introduced his threefold distinction: the locutionary, the illocutionary, and the prelocutionary acts.
Okay, let's try to unpack this for our listeners because these terms can be a bit intimidating.
Sure, so let's start with the locutionary act. What's that all about?
Well, the locutionary act is simply the act of uttering certain words with a certain meaning and certain grammatical structure.
Okay, so it's the basic act of producing a meaningful utterance.
Exactly, and Austin actually breaks this down further into three sub-acts. The phonetic act, which is just the act of making certain sounds, the phatic act, which is the act of uttering certain words, and the rhetic act, which is the act of using those words with a certain sense and reference.
Okay, so it's like a hierarchical structure. We start with the sounds, then the words, then the meaning.
Right, and then we move on to the illocutionary act, which is the force or intention behind the utterance.
So is it a statement, a question, a command, a promise? What am I trying to do by saying what I'm saying?
Exactly, and it's really important to note that the illocutionary force is not always explicitly stated. It often has to be inferred from the context.
Right. So if I say it's cold in here, I might be making a statement about the temperature, but I might also be implicitly requesting someone to close the window.
Exactly. And that's where the context and our background knowledge of how people use language come into play.
Okay. And then finally, we have the Perlocutionary Act. What's that?
Well, the Perlocutionary Act is the effect that your utterance has on the listener. So it can be persuading them, informing them, inspiring them, scaring them, making them laugh.
Right. So it's the actual impact that your words have on the world.
Exactly. And what's so fascinating for philosophers is that Austin gives us this framework for analyzing the different dimensions of a single speech act. It's not just about the words themselves, but about the speaker's intentions, the hearer's understanding,
Yeah.
and the broader context in which the utterance takes place.
Right. So it's a much more nuanced and holistic view of communication.
Absolutely. And then Searle comes along and takes Austin's ideas even further. He's particularly interested in the idea of constitutive rules for illocutionary acts.
Constitutive rules. Okay. What are those?
Well, Searle's basically trying to understand what makes a particular speech act count as what it is. So, for example, what are the rules that govern the act of promising?
Right. So it's not enough to just say, I promise there are certain conditions that have to be met for it to be a genuine promise.
Exactly. And Searle identifies four main types of rules that are relevant here: propositional content rules, preparatory rules, sincerity rules, and essential rules.
Okay. Can you like those down for us?
Sure. So propositional content rules specify what the utterance has to be about. So for a promise, the content has to be about a future action, that the speaker will perform. Preparatory rules specify the background conditions that have to be in place for the act to be successful. So for a promise, the hearer has to want the speaker to do the action, and it can't be something that the speaker would obviously do anyway. Sincerity rules specify what the speaker has to believe or feel. So for a promise, the speaker has to genuinely intend to carry out the action.
Right. You can't promise something you have no intention of doing.
Exactly. And then finally, we have the essential rule, which specifies what the act essentially amounts to. So for a promise, the essential rule is that the utterance counts as the speaker undertaking an obligation to perform the action.
Okay. So it's like a recipe for a successful promise. You need all these ingredients for it to work.
That's a great analogy. And what's so philosophically interesting about Searle's analysis is that it gives us this very precise and systematic way to think about the nature of speech acts. It helps us understand the conditions under which we can hold each other accountable for what we say.
Right. So it's not just about the words themselves, but about the underlying rules and conventions that govern their use.
Exactly. And Searle also develops this taxonomy, a way of classifying different types of illocutionary acts based on their essential conditions and the direction of fit between words and the world, as well as the speaker's intentions.
Okay. So what are the main categories in this taxonomy?
Well, he identifies five basic types: representatives or assertives, directives, commissives, expressives, and declaratives.
Okay. Can you give us a quick rundown of each one?
Sure, representatives commit the speaker to the truth of a proposition. So they're basically assertions, statements about the world.
Right. So if I say the sky's blue, I'm making a representative statement.
Exactly. And then directives are attempts by the speaker to get the hearer to do something. So they include things like requests, commands, and suggestions.
So close the window, please, would be a directive.
Exactly. And commissives commit the speaker to some future course of action. So they include things like promises, oaths, and threats.
Right. So if I say, I'll meet you at the cafe at noon, I'm making a commissive statement.
Exactly. And then expressives serve to express a psychological state about a state of affairs. So they include things like apologies, congratulations, and condolences.
So if I say, I'm so sorry to hear about your loss, I'm making an expressive statement.
Exactly. And finally, we have declaratives, which are kind of special because they actually bring about a change in the world by virtue of being uttered. So they include things like pronouncing someone husband and wife or declaring war.
Wow. So it's like the words themselves have this magical power.
Well, it's not magic. It's just that these particular utterances have been given a special conventional force within a particular social institution.
Right. So it's like the context and the institution that gives them their power.
Exactly. And Searle argues that these different types of illocutionary acts have different directions of fit between words and the world. So for representatives, the words have to fit the world. That is, the statement has to be true. For directives, the world has to fit the words. That is, that the hearer has to carry out the command, and so on.
Okay, so it's like a complex dance between language intention and reality.
Exactly. And Searle's taxonomy gives us a really useful framework for understanding the different ways in which language can be used to interact with the world.
This is all so fascinating, but I'm starting to feel like we're getting a bit lost in the weeds here. Can we try to bring this back to our listener and why they should care about all this?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the main reasons why speech act theory is so important is that it helps us understand the ethical and social dimensions of language.
Okay, how so?
Well, think about it. When we make promises or apologies or accusations, we're not just uttering words, we're performing actions that have real consequences for ourselves and others.
Right, so our words have a kind of moral weight to them.
Exactly. And speech act theory helps us understand the nature of that weight and the conditions under which we can be held responsible for what we say.
Okay, that makes sense. And it also connects back to that quote we started with about diplomats.
Right, exactly, because
Yeah.
that quote is all about the fact that sometimes people use language in ways that are deliberately misleading or even deceptive.
So it's like they're playing games with the rules of speech acts.
Exactly. And speech act theory gives us a way to analyze those games and to understand how they work.
Okay, that's really helpful. I think I'm starting to get a better grasp on all of this now. So where do we go from here?
Well, I think it's time to move on to another key figure in classical pragmatics, H.P. Grice, and his theory of conversational implicatures.
Ah, yes, Grice, the master of reading between the lines.
Exactly. Grice was really interested in that gap between what is said and what is the difference between the literal meaning of an utterance and the speaker's intended meaning.
Right, and he argued that a lot of our communication relies on this implicit level of meaning, these unspoken understandings that we infer from the context.
Exactly. And he came up with this brilliant idea that our conversations are generally governed by a set of shared principles that he called the cooperative principle and its associated maxims.
The cooperative principle, okay, so what is that all about?
Well, it basically says that we should make our conversational contributions, such as is required at the stage at which it occurs, by the accepted purpose or direction of the talk exchange in which we are engaged.
Wow, that's a mouthful. Can you break that down a bit for us?
Sure. Basically, it means that we should try to be helpful, informative, truthful, relevant, and clear in our conversations.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's like an unspoken agreement that we have with each other when we're talking.
Exactly. And Grice spells this out in more detail with his four maxims of conversation: the maxim of quantity, the maxim of quality, the maxim of relation, and the maxim of manner.
Okay, so what do those maxims say?
Well, the maxim of quantity tells us to be as informative as is required, but not more informative than is required.
So don't give too much information or too little information, just the right amount.
Exactly. And the maxim of quality tells us to try to make our contribution one that is true.
So don't say what you believe to be false or for which you lack adequate evidence.
Right. And the maxim of relation tells us to be relevant.
So make sure your contribution is related to the topic at hand.
Exactly. And the maxim of manner tells us to be perspicuous.
Perspicuous. Okay, what does that mean?
Basically, it means to be clear and easy to understand. So avoid obscurity, ambiguity, and prolixity. Be brief and orderly.
Okay, so basically don't be a confusing jerk.
Right, exactly.
So how do these maxims help us understand conversational implicatures?
Well, the really clever part is that Grice realized that we often flout these maxims intentionally in order to convey an implicit meaning.
Intentionally flout the maxims. Okay,
Yeah.
that's interesting. Can you give us an example?
Sure, imagine you ask me, do you want to go to the movies tonight? And I reply, I have to work late.
Okay, so you're technically not answering my question directly.
Exactly. I'm seemingly violating the maxim of relation because my response isn't directly relevant to your question. But because you assume I'm still trying to be cooperative, you infer that I'm implying that I don't want to go to the movies.
Right, so it's like you're saying no without actually saying no.
Exactly, and that's a conversational implicature. It's a meaning that is conveyed implicitly by flouting one of the maxims.
Okay, so how do we distinguish conversational implicatures from other kinds of meaning?
Well, Grice identified a few key properties of conversational implicatures. They are cancelable, non-detachable, and calculable.
Okay, can you explain what those properties mean?
Sure, cancelability means that the speaker can explicitly deny the implicature without contradicting themselves.
So in my movie example, you could say, I have to work late, but I'd still love to go to the movies if you're up for it.
Exactly, and that would cancel the implicature that you don't want to go non-detachability. Means that the same implicature will generally arise even if you express the same thought in different words.
So instead of saying, I have to work late, you could say, I'm swamped tonight, and the implicature would still be the same.
Exactly. Although there are some exceptions to this rule, particularly with regard to manner implicatures. And finally, calculability means that the hearer can work out the intended meaning by a process of reasoning based on the conventional meaning of the words, the cooperative principle, and the context of the utterance.
Okay, so it's like a kind of logical puzzle that the hearer has to solve.
Exactly. And it's this process of inference that distinguishes conversational implicatures from other kinds of implied meaning, like conventional implicatures.
Conventional implicature. Okay, what are those?
Well, conventional implicatures are associated with specific words or phrases rather than with the flouting of maxims. So, for example, the word but carries conventional implicature of contrast.
So if I say, John is rich, but he's unhappy, the word but implies that there's some kind of unexpected or surprising relationship between John's wealth and his happiness.
Exactly. And this implicature arises regardless of the context or whether any maxims are being flouted. It's just part of the conventional meaning of the word but.
Okay, so how do we distinguish conventional implicatures from conversational implicatures in practice?
Well, one key difference is that conventional implicatures are not cancelable. So if I say, John is rich, but he's unhappy, I can't then say, oh, and by the way, there's no contrast between his wealth and his happiness without contradicting myself.
Right, because the contrast is already built into the meaning of the word but.
Exactly. Whereas with a conversational implicature, I can always cancel it by explicitly stating the opposite.
Okay, that makes sense. And within conversational implicatures themselves, Grice also made a distinction between particularized and generalized implicatures, right?
Yes, that's right. Particularized conversational implicatures are those that arise from specific features of the context of utterance.
So you need to know the details of the situation to understand the implied meaning.
Exactly. Whereas generalized conversational implicatures are inferences that tend to arise by default unless there's something in the context to block them.
Okay, can you give us an example to illustrate the difference?
Sure. Imagine I say, I met a woman this morning.
Okay, so the generalized implicature would be that this woman is not someone you're closely related to, like your wife or your mother.
Exactly, because if it was someone you were closely related to, you would probably have said so.
Right, but if you said, I met a woman this morning while looking shifty-eyed and glancing over your shoulder, the particularized implicature might be something quite different.
Right, exactly. Maybe you're implying that the meeting was secret or illicit.
So it all depends on the context.
Precisely, and Grace also proposed this interesting principle that he called the modified Occam's razor, which basically says that we should favor explanations that rely on implicatures rather than positing ambiguities in the language.
So if we can explain a communicative effect through pragmatic inference, we shouldn't assume that the words themselves have multiple meanings.
Exactly. It's a kind of principle of parsimony. Don't multiply entities beyond necessity.
Okay, and then there's Grice's concept of M-intentions, which is short for meaning intentions.
Right. These are the intentions that are specific to communication. And Grace argues that for an utterance to be genuinely communicative, the speaker has to have an M intention.
Okay, so what are the characteristics of an M-intention?
Well, firstly, it has to be directed towards the hearer. The speaker has to intend for the hearer to recognize their intention. Secondly, it has to be overt. The speaker has to intend for their intention to be recognized. And thirdly, its satisfaction has to consist in being recognized.
So it's not enough for the hearer to just understand the meaning of the words they have to also recognize the speaker's intention behind those words.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting philosophically, because there's been a lot of debate about the precise nature of the response that communicative intentions aim for.
So is it about changing the hearer's beliefs, or is it more fundamentally about the hearer recognizing the speaker's intention?
Right, those are the two main views, and they have different implications for how we define successful communication.
So if I tell you it's raining outside and you believe me even though you haven't looked out the window, is that successful communication?
Well, according to the belief change view, yes, because my utterance has changed your belief state.
But according to the intention recognition view, it might not be successful if you haven't actually recognized my intention to inform you about the weather.
Exactly, and that's a subtle but important distinction.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground with Grice and his theory of conversational implicatures, but there are other important figures in classical pragmatics as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We should definitely talk about Bach and Harnisch and their attempt to create a more unified theory of speech acts and implicatures.
Ah, yes. Bach and Harnisch, they tried to bring together the insights of Austin and Searle with those of Grice.
Exactly, and they leaned more heavily towards Grice's inferential view, arguing that even determining the basic locutionary act, what is actually said involves a degree of inference.
So we're not just passively decoding the linguistic meaning. We're also actively constructing an interpretation based on our understanding of the speaker's intentions and the context.
Precisely. And they introduced this idea of the operative meaning, which includes identifying the intended reference, understanding the properties and relations being ascribed, and determining the relevant times.
Right, so it's not just about the literal meaning of the words, but about what the speaker is doing with those words.
Exactly. And they also emphasize the importance of the communicative presumption, which is this shared mutual belief between speaker and hearer that the speaker has a recognizable illocutionary intent.
So we assume that when someone is speaking to us, they're trying to communicate something and that we should be able to figure out what that is.
Right. And this presumption is crucial for making communication possible in the first place.
Okay, and Bach and Harnisch also proposed their own taxonomy of illocutionary acts, right?
Yes, they categorize them into constatives, directives, commissives, and acknowledgments.
So they dropped declaratives from Searle's list.
Yes, and they also distinguish between communicative illocutionary acts, which are fundamentally intention-based, and conventional illocutionary acts, which rely more on established linguistic conventions.
Okay, so can you give us some examples of conventional illocutionary acts?
Sure, things like greetings, apologies, and congratulations are often conventional. They follow set formulas and don't require a lot of inference.
Right, whereas if I say, I promise to pick you up at 8, that's a communicative illocutionary act because it's based on my intention to actually do that.
Exactly. And Bach and Harnisch also proposed this model of the hearer's inferential reasoning process that they called the speech act schema.
The speech act schema, okay, what's that all about?
Well, it's basically a step-by-step account of how the hearer moves from the literal sentence meaning to an understanding of the perlocutionary act.
So it's like a roadmap for how we interpret what someone is saying.
Exactly. And it involves drawing on the communicative and conversational presumptions, as well as the hearer's background knowledge and mutual beliefs shared with the speaker.
Right, so it's a complex process that takes into account all these different factors.
Exactly. And Bach and Harnisch also discuss how this model can account for non-literal and indirect speech acts, which are cases where the speaker's intended meaning doesn't match the literal meaning of the words.
Right, so if I say, it's hot in here, and I really mean please open the window, that's an indirect speech act.
Exactly. And their model shows how the hearer can infer the intended meaning, even in these cases.
Okay, so Bach and Harnisch's work really represents a kind of bridge between classical philosophical pragmatics and more linguistic and psychological approaches to pragmatics.
Yes, they're really trying to integrate the insights of philosophy, linguistics, and psychology to create a more comprehensive theory of communication.
And they're also highlighting the fact that pragmatic considerations can't be neatly separated from semantics.
Right, even determining what is said. The basic locutionary act often involves pragmatic inference.
Okay, so I think we've covered the main points of classical far-side pragmatics. Now let's turn our attention to classical near-side pragmatics.
Sure, and here the focus shifts to the interplay between semantics and pragmatics in determining what is said, particularly when we're dealing with things like indexicals, demonstratives, proper names, and definite descriptions.
So it's about how context influences the very content of our utterances, not just the implied meaning.
Exactly. And one of the key figures in this area is David Kaplan, with his work on indexicals and demonstratives.
Indexicals and demonstratives. Okay, so what are those?
Well, indexicals are words like I, you, here, now, that refer to different things depending on who is speaking when and where they're speaking.
Right, so if I say I'm here now, the meaning of those words changes depending on who I is, where here is, and when now is.
Exactly, and demonstratives are words like this and that pick out objects in the immediate context.
So if I say this book, I'm referring to a specific book that we can both see.
Right, and Kaplan developed this really influential theory to explain how the meaning of these expressions is determined by the context.
Okay, so how does his theory work?
Well, he uses three key concepts: context, character, and content.
So context is basically all the relevant information about the situation in which the utterance is produced.
Right, things like who the speaker is, where they are when they're speaking, and so on.
Okay, and what about character?
Well, character is the linguistic meaning of the expression. It's a function from contexts to contents.
So it's like a rule that tells us how the meaning of the expression changes depending on the context.
Exactly. And then content is the proposition expressed by the utterance in a particular context.
So it's the actual meaning that we get when we apply the character to the context.
Right. And Kaplan argues that this process is all rule governed. There's no ambiguity or guesswork involved.
Okay, but doesn't that mean that Kaplan is really doing semantics, not pragmatics?
Well, that's a good question, and it's one that has been debated by philosophers. Kaplan himself considered his work to be part of semantics because he saw the contribution of context as being rule-governed and part of the inherent meaning of these expressions.
But other philosophers argue that Kaplan's theory is actually pragmatic because it relies on the notion of a context of utterance, which is something that is determined by the speaker's intentions and the circumstances of the communication.
Right, so there's definitely some overlap between semantics and pragmatics in this area.
Okay, so let's move on to another key figure in classical near-side pragmatics, Peter Strawson and his work on presuppositions.
Ah, yes, Strawson. He's famous for his critique of Russell's theory of definite descriptions.
Definite descriptions. Okay, can you remind us what those are?
Sure, they're phrases of the form the F, where F is some property. So, for example, the King of France, or the tallest building in the world.
Right, and Russell had this very influential theory of how definite descriptions work. He argued that they're really disguised existential claims. So, the King of France is bald really means there exists a unique King of France, and he is bald.
Exactly. And Strawson came along and said, hang on a minute, that's not how we actually use definite descriptions in everyday language.
So, what did he propose instead?
Well, he argued that definite descriptions function as referential terms. They're used to pick out particular objects in the world.
Okay, but what if there is no object that fits the description, like the King of France?
Well, Strawson said that in those cases, the utterance simply doesn't have a truth value. It's neither true nor false.
So it's like the question of whether the King of France is bald just doesn't arise.
Exactly. And he introduced this concept of presupposition to explain what's going on.
So a presupposition is a proposition that has to be true in order for an utterance to have a truth value.
Exactly. And Strawson argued that the existence of the referent of a definite description is a presupposition of any utterance containing that description.
Okay. And this concept of presupposition turned out to be really important for pragmatics because it showed how our background assumptions about the world can influence the very meaning of what we say.
Right. And it also raised a lot of interesting philosophical questions about the nature of truth reference and the relationship between language and reality.
So what are some of those questions?
Well, one question is whether presupposition is a semantic phenomenon or a pragmatic phenomenon.
So is it part of the meaning of the words themselves, or is it something that arises from how we use those words in context?
Exactly. And there are good arguments on both sides of this debate.
Okay, and there's also the famous projection problem for the semantic view of presuppositions.
Ah, yes, the projection problem. This is the problem of explaining how presuppositions behave when they're embedded in complex sentences.
So, for example, if I say, John doesn't realize that the King of France is bald, does that sentence presuppose that there is a King of France?
Right, and if so, how does that presupposition project up from the embedded clause to the main clause?
It's a really tricky issue, and it's one that has led many philosophers to favor pragmatic explanations of presupposition.
Like Robert Stolnaker's view that presupposition involves taking the truth of a proposition for granted in a particular conversational context.
Okay, so let's move on to another important figure in classical near-side pragmatics, Keith Donnellan and his work on the different uses of definite descriptions.
Right, Donnellan. He's famous for his distinction between the attributive and referential uses of definite descriptions.
Okay, can you remind us what that distinction is?
Sure, so in the attributive use, the speaker is using the description to say something about whoever fits that description.
So, for example, if I say, the murderer is insane, I'm using the murderer attributively because I'm saying that whoever committed the murder must be insane.
Exactly. And in this case, the existence of a referent is a presupposition of the utterance.
So if there's no murderer, then my statement is neither true nor false.
Right. But in the referential use, the speaker is using the description to pick out a particular individual that they have in mind, even if that individual doesn't perfectly fit the description.
Okay, can you give us an example of that?
Sure. Imagine you're at a party and you see a man drinking a martini, and you say to your friend, the man drinking a martini is a famous philosopher.
Okay, so you're using the man drinking a martini to refer to that particular individual.
Exactly. And in this case, the existence of a referent is not a presupposition of the utterance.
So even if the man isn't actually drinking a martini, or if he's not a famous philosopher, my statement can still be true or false of that particular individual.
Right, because my intention was to refer to him regardless of whether the description is accurate.
Okay, so the referential use is all about speaker intention.
Exactly. And Donnellan argued that this distinction is important for understanding how definite descriptions work in language.
Right, because it shows that the same description can be used in different ways with different truth conditions.
Exactly. And this distinction has also been influential in other areas of philosophy, like philosophy of mind and philosophy of action.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground with classical near-sight pragmatics, but now it's time to move on to contemporary pragmatic theory.
Okay, and contemporary pragmatics is a vast and diverse field with all sorts of different approaches. But there are a few common threads that run through most of the work.
So what are some of those common threads?
Well, most contemporary pragmatists agree on the importance of distinguishing between what is said and what is implicated.
So they're still building on Grice's legacy.
Exactly. And they also agree on the role of principles guiding communication, whether those principles are framed in terms of rationality cooperation or cognitive efficiency.
And they generally accept the notion of communicative intention as being central to understanding how communication works.
Right. But they differ in their methodological approaches. Some are more philosophically oriented, some are more linguistically oriented, and some are more empirically oriented, drawing on findings from psychology and cognitive science.
Okay, so it's a very interdisciplinary field.
Absolutely. And one of the central debates in contemporary pragmatics revolves around the relative importance of two basic models of linguistic communication, the coding-decoding model and the intention recognition model.
Okay, so the coding decoding model is the more traditional view. It sees communication as a process of encoding and decoding messages using a shared linguistic code.
Right, so the speaker encodes their intended meaning into words, and the hearer decodes those words to arrive at the speaker's meaning.
And this model emphasizes the role of linguistic conventions and rules in making communication possible.
Exactly, whereas the intention recognition model sees communication as a more inferential process.
So the hearer has to go beyond the literal meaning of the words and use their knowledge of the speaker, the context, and the world to figure out what the speaker is really trying to say.
Exactly, and this model emphasizes the role of mind reading and pragmatic competence in communication.
Okay, so which model is right?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, and there are strong arguments on both sides. Some theorists argue that the coding-decoding model is too simplistic and that it can't account for the full range of communicative phenomena.
Like irony, sarcasm, and metaphor.
Exactly, whereas other theorists argue that the intention recognition model is too complex and that it makes communication seem more mysterious than it really is.
So it's like a classic philosophical debate between simplicity and complexity.
Right, and there are also a lot of intermediate positions that try to combine elements of both models.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the specific theories that have been proposed within contemporary pragmatics.
Sure, one of the most influential theories is relevance theory, which was developed by Dan Sperber and Deirdre Wilson.
Relevance theory. Okay, I've heard of that one. What's the basic idea?
Well, relevance theory argues that human cognition is fundamentally geared towards maximizing relevance.
Maximizing relevance. What does that mean?
It means trying to get the most cognitive effects for the least processing effort.
Cognitive effects, so like new information or insights.
Exactly, and Sperber and Wilson argue that this principle of relevance guides all of our cognitive processes, including communication.
So when we're interpreting an utterance, we're not just trying to decode the literal meaning of the words, we're also trying to figure out what the speaker intended to communicate and what implications those words have for our understanding of the world.
Exactly, and relevance theory provides a very detailed account of how this process works.
Okay, so what are some of the key